Guys, it's time for some game theory. Good evening. Eric Garland here, Game Theory today. I'm here with my colleague Stefano Ritondale. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. This is an oasis of all intel questions. We will take inquiries from the audience for all my loyal viewers out there. You hit us with questions, and we're in a mood. We'll just answer them. We might not even filter it that much. What do you think?
I'm all for it, man. Let's just Bill O'Reilly. Let's do it live.
Alrighty. So, you and I are both in the intelligence business. Tell us about your history in intelligence. Like, you're a real one. You know what you're talking about.
Okay, so my background. Well, here's the funny thing, Eric. Actually, I was a battalion S2. I was a battalion intelligence officer on active duty. And then when I went to the reserves, I was a brigade.
Can you
S2.
draw that out from my people here? And battalion S2. So
battalion intelligence officer in charge, right? So I was like the intel officer for the battalion active duty. Specifically, I was the battalion intelligence officer. I was a commissioned officer. I commissioned for the Merchant Marine Academy, which is one of the service academies in the U.S. U.S. military. So there's West Point, Annapolis, Air Force, Coast Guard, and the Merchant Marine, Kings Point, right? And I commissioned
that Merchant Marine stuff right now. That the gates, the Hormuz, it is going on like it's super hot.
So I actually, as a cadet, when I was a cadet, part of your commissioning problem when you graduate for your graduation, for your license degree, you have to get your degree and then you have to get your Coast Guard license. So it's both, right? Your college degree and your Coast Guard license, because they train you to be a merchant mariner regardless of what career path you take. So part of that, I had to sail for 300 days out of the year. And this was back in 2010. And so back then, that's when Somali piracy was a huge problem. And in my boat, we sailed off the Horn of Africa. Pirates were everywhere. Actually, we had pirate vessels kind of scout out our vehicle. We had security guards showing weapons, and they're like, screw this, we'll go away. But I've sailed a couple of times through the Straits of Hormuz. I've done. I was in a military sealift command as a cadet, as a midshipman, resupplying U.S. naval warships in the Straits of Hormuz and in the Persian Gulf and off the Horn of Africa. And so, so I'm very familiar. It's exactly your point. We can obviously talk about that. But after my time in the Merchant Marine Academy, I graduated, got my degree, I got my Coast Guard license. And after 300 days on a ship, I was like, never again. Like, that's not happening. Like, my wife to this day still begs me to go into a cruise ship. I'm like, absolutely not. And I commissioned Army, and I went armor. I was an armor officer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And really, I had a really weird career path. After my platoon leader time, I was slated to get another platoon because I did a short platoon time, about like 9 to 10 months or something like that. Because the goal was they were going to put me in one platoon, and they were going to put me in another platoon because they were standing up a new battalion. And so the idea was, okay, we had an influx of lieutenants. We're going to have more platoon leader slots open. So let's get some of these senior ones to put them in another one. And that way we can get these influx to do it, and we'll wait. And so while I was waiting, though, a career opportunity came up to be the aide-de-camp to a general. And I said, sure, why not? I'll try something different. I'll try something new. And I got the position to be the aide-de-camp. And that's when I deployed to Jordan as part of the kind of basically the counter-ISIS campaign. I was there from 2015 to 2016. And he was the senior military commander for, the counter-ISIS campaign for the U.S. inside of Jordan. And what that meant was he had a lot of engagements with foreign generals, specifically Jordanians. And as his aide, I kind of became his note taker. So when you're the note taker of a general officer, obviously there's a lot of people within the U.S. government are very interested in those notes. Sure. And so that's how, in a very weird way, I start getting involved in this aspect of kind of maybe in a way intelligence, right? Overt, I had U.S. Army, nothing covert, but you're taking notes, and then you're passing those notes off to the U.S. government, and then you're having these conversations. And it was a very enlightening experience for me. And I decided, okay, you know what? I kind of wanted to make this my career path. When I came back from my deployment, I was gone too long. So I said, you know what? I'm not going to continue active duty. My daughter was just born. I missed her first year of her life. And I said, okay, I'm not going to do this long term. But within that decision, I was put in the 1AD, First Armor Division. I was put in the Deputy Collection Manager. I was kind of like a temporary hold, just a temporary. And technically, that position doesn't exist in reality. It's like a made up position. There's the Collection Manager, and that's it. And they kind of like create the Deputy Collection Manager, and they kind of put me there. And I'm like, all right, sure.
Now, when you say collection, is that intelligence collection?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, 100%. Okay. Within the G2 intelligence. And so what these guys do
within
is
the G2. So you were an S2 for the battalion, and the G2 is, of course, the head intelligence officer for
the division.
General.
Right, for the 2-star. So the G2 within a division, which is a 2-star general, the G2 is a lieutenant colonel. And so within the G2,
right,
generally they kind of break it up in they have different sections. And one of the sections is the collection cell. And the collection cell, their job is to basically plan, okay, I have all these assets, intelligence assets. How do I plan to send them to collect intelligence, right? That's the job of the collection. So I was made the deputy G2, and it was kind of almost like, in a way, it was almost like an internship for me as a senior lieutenant. It was like an internship. And the issue was that unit was deploying to, I believe, Iraq, but I just came back from deployment to Jordan. So the U.S. military doesn't like, if you just came from a deployment, you can't. They're not going to send you to another deployment immediately after. They right. frown upon that generally. And so, since everybody was going to Iraq, a position opened up with the MPs, the Military Police Battalion, which is a lieutenant colonel is in charge, for the S2, the intelligence position. And because of my background and not necessarily my background, just my experience, they said, hey, why don't you take this position? We think you can do it. We'll let you try it out. And when I went to the MPs and I was interviewing with the executive officer, who's like the battalion second in command, I basically told them, like, look, I'm not technically an intelligence officer. Like, I'm not what you would call branch detail. So branch detail is, as a lieutenant, I'm going to do one thing, but when I become captain, I'm changing completely to a different branch, right? So in the MI world, in the military intelligence world, and the U.S. Army, that's very common. I tell people, it's like a reverse pyramid. You have this many lieutenants, and then it explodes to captains, and then it goes back back top to like your senior ranking, right? So the captain ranks, it blows up, and that's what it's called, this branch detail. The thing is, I wasn't branch detail. So I became a battalion S2 as an armor officer. And to be honest, the MP, the executive officer, when I interviewed, he loved it because he's like, oh, I get a combat arms guy in my unit. I'd never get an armor officer. So yeah, I'm going to keep you. And so for 2 years, I was the battalion intelligence officer for this MP battalion. And then there I did the border mission under the first Trump administration. I went to San Diego, and I did 2 overseas training missions. I did one in Mexico where I trained the Mexican military for a month. And then I did another one in Niger where I trained the Nigerian military for 5 weeks.
So you have been around. You've done.
I will say both between my time in the Merchant Marine Academy as a cadet and in the Army, I have had the fortunate aspect that I've traveled probably way more than most people in my similar pay grade in the Army, specifically a junior officer. Yes.
Very Straits of Hormuz, Jordan, Mexico, Niger. California.
I've been to, and I've also been through the Straits of Gibraltar. I've been through the Straits of Malacca, Philippines, Singapore, Djibouti, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Sicily. And then during my deployment to Jordan, we did a lot of TDY. So like Lebanon, Israel, Qatar, Kuwait. Again, like I had very fortunate that I managed to travel a lot as a junior officer around the world. Yeah.
And so you're doing intelligence, so you're doing threat assessment of all the creepy crawlies out there. Sure, the overt, there's a, you know, there's a squad here, they're armed with this, but I imagine a lot of covert operations from various bad guys, many of whom might be coordinated by the Iranians.
Correct. So
Hypothetically, I'm not trying to
yeah,
elicit you.
no, no. But so to your point, right? When I left the active duty, when I became a reservist, say brigadist 2, and then I became the brigadist 3, which is the operations officer. But I was kind of dual hatted, both operations and intelligence officer in that billet. And there we were focused in the Pacific. But when I was I got hired as a contractor, and then I worked in the G2 as an Op4 analyst, so opposing force analyst and intelligence planner. And for those who don't know, what an Op4 analyst is basically you think you're hired to basically think as the enemy, right?
Red
That's your
teaming and
job.
all that, yeah.
Red team.
What would I do if I had their capabilities and their desires?
Exactly. And then I
intent is.
Exactly. So it's capabilities, the intent, and then my job was to replicate that in military exercises, to train our guys before their deployment, right? But to meet training objectives.
So you literally did. This is my catchphrase inadvertently, but you did game theory. You did strategic simulation of, all right, you play these bad guys, you play these guys, you play our ally, I'm going to play us.
And to your point, it wasn't like most people in the Army, like if they hear that, generally you would see that at the tactical level. Like I have, the NTC is one of the training areas in California, 29 Palms for the Marines. Like, here's my guns, here's my tanks. And it's very tactical. And we fight that because of the unit I worked for. It's called the 32nd Army Air Missile Defense Command. They are Patriots and THAADs, which right now I think a lot of people might now be familiar with.
Air missile defense, just so.
Yeah.
Okay.
And those are inherently strategic thinking level assets, right? Because you deploy Patriots to send a message generally, right? Most people would think we send the carrier strike group. What you don't hear or might not, or you miss is I'm going to deploy a Patriot or a THAAD at the same conversation. So we have to think at that broad
surface to air missiles.
Correct. Surface to surface missiles.
Surface to surface missiles. Okay.
So the enemy. So the Patriot and THAAD are surface to air. Their primary threat are ballistic missiles, which are surface to surface.
Got it.
That's why they exist. They can also shoot down planes, drones, etc.
Right.
So I had to think that, but what was very interesting is that technically through the Army, I never officially became an MI officer by billet. Like I had the experience, I just never finished the training because I was doing the training and then I got medically discharged. So I never officially on paper became an MI officer. I left the military as an armor officer. I just had a lot of experience in the position, both on active duty, reserve, and as a contractor, that enabled me to kind of be successful. And then
you were just constantly collecting intelligence, reporting on it. You were there in the room when people were discussing it. You did the output notes from the meetings, and you did strategic simulations, game theory, if you will, on how to respond. So you were doing operational plans. That's intelligence where I'm from. So
and then while I was a contractor, that's when I created this, which is All Source News, the my Twitter account or X account on OSINT that kind of did OSINT for cartels. And it started out as a hobby in 2021, in March 2021. And actually, I think that's how you and I first met, was through really my cartel coverage on Twitter. And obviously, we saw what that matters, and that's kind of become a huge focus of mine, obviously. And now my official title, after all my contracting and all that, was I'm the chief intelligence officer. My other position of Artorias, which is an open source intelligence company that leverages. It's an AI-driven OSINT company that does collection, analysis, assessments, alerting, and decision-making leveraging AI. So that's kind of a summary of my entire career. But what I would want people to say is that it wasn't, I did some training, obviously, but I never officially became an IAM officer, but just had a lot of exposure and experience that really enabled me, I guess, to be successful.
So you've been there at these critical times during the global war on terror. Insofar as that was, that's what we called it. It wasn't. I'm editorializing. here. It was not a very coherent time for our national security. I was in Washington, D.C. Through all of that prior to 9/11, then after. So I have a couple critiques, but so you were there 2010. You're out in the field and you're doing intel. And here we are right now, where the United States has finally changed its doctrine, isn't really working with NATO on this particular thing, and we've just basically erased Iran. We have significantly degraded what they had for weaponry. We have functionally decapitated the regime, and it's a question of when this stops and what comes after. And I'd love your opinion on it. Having been looking at it for as many years as I have, this is different, which I mean, we should all understand. Like, they were threatening this kind of conflict, and people were making all kinds of money off building the weapons systems, doing intelligence around it, doing political donations, fundraising around who's tougher on Iran. We're not doing that. We put the Gerald Ford and we put the Lincoln carrier groups out there, and we just started putting warheads on foreheads.
Yep.
And it's what's fascinating to me is how much the defense commentary regime really doesn't know what to do with itself. Like, there's not as many great opinion havers right now, which I think is delightful. You feel the center of gravity is shifting, because nobody knows what to say, because we're actually doing it. We're doing something, and we're not dragging out. It's not like Iraq, where we went in and then nobody had a plan to get out. It's not that we couldn't have made a plan to get out. We could have. We didn't. And that was the point for a lot of people, I think, that we would just be screwing around, bringing democracy, but not really, for decades. And I'll tell you, I was in Washington, D.C., and I got to watch the BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes in Northwest D.C. and Bethesda, Maryland, and McLean, Virginia, become Bentleys and Rolls-Royces in a short period of time, which I think may have been the real output of all that. But now we've taken the entire Iranian regime and we've put a hurting on them. Now, how much of that is quantified? I mean, this is fog of war. It's going on right now, and there's only so much we can know about the situation from the non-classified perspective. But it seems like they're doing some damage. So what's your read on this?
It's funny because while we were talking, I got the alert from our Sitrep that I know you did a video, and the USS Abraham Lincoln did one of their helicopters in the carrier strike group just engaged an Iranian vessel who approached the carrier strike group, and so they destroyed that. Right, so got the alert right there. That's kind of what's going on, and I think it's to your point that highlights. It's interesting when you're somebody like, when I talk about Iran, I really both, publicly, either with the media and the spaces and all that, I really try to analyze it from my perspective of working with the 32nd and be involved in that. And sure. I mean, I've said this multiple times and I say it again. The amount, what is the primary force that Iran has, specifically in a conflict like this? It's their ballistic missile force and their drones and their cruise missiles, right? Mm-hmm. I would say that, and maybe most people would be shocked by this, is that the quantities that we're seeing of the Iranian ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles that they've launched is significantly less than I would have expected. Significantly less. And it's interesting, kind of I'm going to be a little bit light on this. Maybe people who think that maybe the United States is not having as much success as they'd have, the argument they're making, well, maybe Iran is holding back on their capabilities. And my counter to that would be, holding back for what?
Right?
What?
Like, what are they waiting for?
What are you exactly?
What's the perfect time to fire missiles at somebody? I don't know. Maybe when they're decimating your capital? When they're decapitating your government?
It smacks. It's the same argument with the Russians, right? When you hear this with the Russians and Ukraine,
Right.
oh, they're just holding back. It's been 4 years, guys. 4 years.
Right.
4 years. Holding back for what? It's the same with the Iranians.
CBS News came out with a comment. I'm not going to say who it is or what think tank, but there was some guy at a think tank, and he said, well, they could really get committed to getting a nuclear weapon now. I'm like, with what? With the 5 cinder blocks that are knocked over on each other right now? Like what?
But it goes. I think the problem is that there's this. It's. I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding of the Iranian problem set, right? Because when you build war games, one of the inherent aspects you have to build it on is what's the trigger event, right? Because in a war game, anybody who's done war games, specifically at the strategic level, it's not, you don't just get your bunch of your military guys and say, congratulations, you're at war, go fight. No,
there has to be a context to it. What was the trigger event? Because it's like a fist fight. There's always rules. People will sit there and a fist fight go on a certain way, but if somebody digs out their car keys and puts them in somebody's eye socket, they'll intervene. The context matters. And the conduct matters.
Because the context sets the stage for why you're fighting and what the enemy end goal is, right? Because you can build a war game that is, let's say, a tit for tat, because you want to train for a tit for tat. Let's say that's all you care about. All you want to do. And by the way, for military, and this goes to anybody, if I see another goddamn comment of, in this war game, Ukraine or France or the UK Marines decimated an American brigade, it's like, you have no idea what you're talking about, number one. Because you don't understand the notion of military exercises. When you do military exercises, right, the vast majority of them are designed to meet commander training objectives, not to win. You don't win, you train. That's the goal. Even when you do all the construct, even when you make up a scenario, even if you either have a fake enemy or a real country enemy, and you build it, the goal of a military exercise is to meet the commander's training objective. Now, there are other exercises that you do that are intended to see, if the conflict happened now, how can we fare and fight in that? The problem of these, though, because that's when you see these commentaries about, we do war games, and you've seen this, right? We fight the Chinese and we lose. Okay. This is what I have.
And we lose.
Here's the issue I have with this. Because I can tell you right now, you never hear that now about the Russians. But I guarantee you, if it was 2020, you would hear that all the time about the Russians. Here's the problem when you're doing war games. Who is acting as the Chinese in a war game, or who is acting as the Russians in a war game? It's Americans, right?
Right.
That know how China, Russia, Iran, or whatever made up enemy you create, they know how to fight, and they know how to apply that doctrine, but they're always going to have an American military mindset. And the American military mindset, for example, is very adamant about, for example, you don't wait for orders, you execute. That's the number one thing, right? Very incentivizes inherently down troops to fight organically. We see this in the Russians with Ukraine. That's not how they fight. They're not a professionally trained military who
fight
does
differently and for different reasons with different command structures and different strategic goals.
Right.
And you got to have, and when you're doing a war game, you've got to have your intelligence on the context. It's got to be good about what the sociocultural context that the other guys are going to be fighting with. Like, you cannot assume North Koreans are going to follow the same, the same style of fighting and thinking that guys that were trained at the Naval War College in Quantico. They're different. You try to imitate that, but there's always going to be, to your point, that cultural barrier. It's impossible. And to your point, it's also from the intelligence perspective. A lot of times we just assume, right? There's an aspect of intelligence that I think you and I and Eric understand, which is there's one thing in the ability to collect it,
There's another aspect is, do you know how to analyze it? And more importantly, do you know how to analyze it that then enables your commanders to make a decision? And that's not an easy process. That might seem as natural for an American or somebody in NATO, but in other countries it's not. And I think that's what the fundamental difference is. And going back to kind of Iran, analyzing this, I think that's kind of the main issues that Iran is having, right? One, their quantity and their ballistic missiles is way lower than we thought. Even their quality aspect is not as where I thought it was. But the problem that I think it also goes back to is it's very how they're fighting is there's not a plan. There's not a process within intelligence. You probably heard of this. Intel drives operation, right?
Ideally.
Right. I think their only thought process right now is how can we cause the price of oil to go up, and we hope that causes President Trump to stop this operation. But that's not. I mean, it makes sense, but the way they're executing this operation doesn't match necessarily that intent.
I mean, that now we get into what is the quality of their strategic thinking. And you get a lot of dudes who are in the Iranian regime who were, who went to school in Paris, who went to school in London at some point, or their dads did, or it's been different over the years. The guys who were there in the 80s, almost all those guys went to school in London at some point, or, Berlin, or New York, Washington. And then by the 80s, we're facing these guys that really have a pretty good sense of Western thinking. But now it's many years since then. But the question is, can they understand what we're up to? Can they think in our shoes, or Trump's, or whatever? Because so much has changed here. Trump's perspective here as an 80-year-old guy who got into his second term. His first term as a president was very contentious, and his second one was spent avoiding prison. And whether either he's free to achieve all his goals and dreams, or if he's on a revenge, like a Quentin Tarantino revenge rampage in the last 38 minutes of the movie, either might be applicable here, maybe even deserved. But that's what's going on. If the Iranians aren't able to see what's going on, like we've broken with the UN, we've broken with NATO in a lot of different ways. We've certainly broken with the United Kingdom. They're not assisting. This is America and Israel are getting this thing done. And the question I have about the Iranian regime is, did they have any good operational plans in? Or were they just assuming that this crap was going to go on forever, where we would negotiate internally and we wouldn't? I mean, I think the world is starting to get sensitized right now to what it means to have 11 nuclear powered carriers. Like, we have aircraft carriers. We have guys on them that know how to sail them in combat. And they can, one of the guys I worked with early on in DC, he was a military officer, and he said, we only do two things really well. We kill people and we break their stuff. Everything else, call the State Department. These are guys that, we may not be great nation builders, but we are expert nation unbuilders. And I think
that's what the plan is. I would agree with you.
And Trump was talking just today saying, well, we could completely destroy their electrical infrastructure in a way that would take 25 years to rebuild. We could do that in 1 hour. We don't want to do that. We want there to be an after where these guys can have a great country. I mean, the amount of power that you've got to have in order to take that position, where he knows he has the cards, or to use it less metaphorically, he has the Tomahawks. He has the B-2s.
Well,
he has the B-1 Lancers.
That's not necessarily the kinetic aspect in the military. The U.S. have cyber and space. That when we're talking about the electric grid, that's where the United States is very successful. But I think when we're talking about Iran, this is kind of from the Iranian perspective, I think is, if they survive, in their mind, that's a win. That's their goal. And the regime's survival. Now, here's the problem. let's say this lasts a month, and at the end of the month, there's an agreement, and when the U.S. stops, right? That doesn't. The problem for the Iranians is just as the 12-day war was a fundamental problem from Iran that didn't necessarily translate to the January protests that we saw last 2 months ago in Iran. There was some connections to that. Now the Islamic Republic has to say, okay, you survived this latest round, but now you have a huge problem that you have to deal with your own internal population and rebuild and all that, right? And so again, it's this construct of regime change. And what I would say from an intelligence perspective, it's very important to highlight something. It is extremely difficult to analyze and try to get indicators and warnings of what we would call the will to fight, which in this construct is the regime survival even. It's very difficult because the perfect example of this is the Arab Spring, where a man burned himself alive outside of a fruit stand in Tunisia, and a month later, the dictator who survived for decades was overthrown.
Right. It's hard to measure that.
Nobody in their right mind would have thought in 2008, 2 years later, the Arab Spring was even a remote possibility geopolitically. This is what we call the black swan events that might come up from an intelligence perspective, and it is very hard to analyze it. And not only is it very hard to analyze it, but it's also very hard to try to collect on it or to try to anticipate it.
Because your networks, your human networks might not be the ones that you have in place. To wit, it was, the price of bread doubled around that time. And there was another factor. You had this social media network that we're broadcasting in part to right now called Twitter / now X, that it was being used for real-time communications and real-time, but both like strategic messaging of the people that wanted political change, but also tactical. When they were getting attacked by regime security forces, they would then, DM their buddies and go, nope, not around that corner, 2 blocks away. So it was both strategic. Here are our objectives. We want to get on the BBC. We want to talk about what the people of our country want. And then tactics. Nope. Turn left, guys. We'll meet you there after. And
it goes back to that though, because I think that's where OSINT. I've made this argument a lot where that's where OSINT kind of is a new construct of intelligence, really, because but that's like it's also analyzing it from the perspective of how SIGINT really, like, HUMINT is the oldest intelligence that ever existed, and for the longest time, HUMINT was it. That's all you had. It was just HUMINT, and then during the turn of the 20th century, we had IMINT with the ability to fly planes or even pigeons with photographs and have that was the beginning of imagery intelligence. That now
did we use pigeons for imagery intelligence? Did pigeons collect? Did we strap little cameras to them?
I mean, I would assume so. I know maybe during the Cold War they probably put little pigeons and they say fly over there and take pictures. But that's just IMINT,
however it works.
But World War One. But World War One, you have a plane and you have a scout observing everything from a plane back in the day when they mentioned the plane. That's imagery. Even if
hot air balloons, Civil War, I believe.
Exactly.
Now, I don't know if they took cameras up there, but it's the same concept. The idea of Overwatch. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say the other thing is like when you're dealing with intelligence, it's also SIGINT, right? With the invention of the ability for modern day communications, then it became key to intercept those communications.
Right.
Exactly why the U.S. and the famous telegraph from Germany to Mexico in World War I, how the British intercepted that and turned it into America as a cause belli for America kind of to join World War I. But that's SIGINT, right? And so SIGINT was a new intelligence format that it kind of existed within the 20th century. And we've seen that it kind of explode and become much more prevalent as communications become much more digitalized and virtual. But I think that's the thing about OSINT, where OSINT really exploded within the last 20 years. As social media becomes the predominant form for many people to communicate and to express opinions and to express their livelihoods, and as the world continues to be much more interconnected through the internet and more importantly through social media, That's where OSINT continues to grow and influence and power. And that's where I think we see a lot of the aspects of how OSINT is a major factor now. And it's a new form of intelligence because it's a predominant one. Because OSINT, what was OSINT 50, 60 years ago? It was just reading the newspaper and trying to get an idea through newspapers that was published from other countries and looking at their TV stations, what was going on there. That was the best you could get in OSINT. You didn't have that, what you have now with the advance in social media. It's only going to grow and grow and grow. And I think in this construct of Iran, that's where you have this all-source kind of aspect where I think obviously the United States is much leading ahead and Iran is significantly lacking, but the desperation for them is for regime survival. And I'd like to quickly, Eric, if I may, I mean, I don't know if you saw that Reuters article yesterday that kind of talked about the U.S. intelligence reports about regime survival and kind of the I don't know if you saw that.
I don't think I did.
So yesterday, Reuters had an exclusive report that indicated that U.S. intelligence assessment was that the regime was not in the verge of collapse, right? They had a lot of regime stability. And even with the loss of the killing of the supreme leader and the killing of 40 leaders within the Islamic Republic, and that's kind of backed up by other reports from, let's say, American and Israeli press, where they were hoping that the initial, shock and awe and decapitation strike might create a scenario like Venezuela, where maybe it would open the opportunities for the United States. And they were like, okay, well, it doesn't, so we need to kind of continue on. But what I tell people about when they're reading intelligence reports, specifically, we're not going to read the actual report, right? Because that's at a very high level classification. If you read the Reuters
and this is very intense. This is happening as we speak. So I should hope that the U.S. military is holding in some of the real assessment of the regime, because they need to make tactical decisions that
well, I think that's why we're seeing the last 48 hours, we've seen a change where Israel, what they're doing much more so than now, they're actually trying to hunt besieged military forces, right? The besieged, which is very responsible within Iran for that internal stability. They're trying to conduct actual drone strikes and targeting their checkpoints, not just the buildings and the leaderships and the bases, like actually trying to hunt these guys down to try to maybe change that. But what I want to get to this intelligence report from Reuters, we got to be very careful when you leak when reported intelligence get leaked to the press. A lot of times it's not a complete picture. Why do I say that? One, we don't know the confidence level of this intelligence report. Number one, it could be a low, medium, or high, right? We don't know. And that really, because you can have an intelligence assessment, but you can have a low confidence because you're lacking key intelligence that might help you have a higher level of confidence. Because I can give you an assessment. I assess, Eric, that you and I are going to have a great conversation on your YouTube channel.
Assess high confidence.
But high confidence, why? Let me assess high confidence. Why? Because you and I
we have the two best sources of it. Yes.
But in reality, because you and I have talked to each other extensively outside of this venue. You and I have talked to each other.
That's true.
Right. That's why I can say I have a high confidence. But let's say you and I have never talked before. I can say
you'd assess low confidence or no confidence.
Exactly. That's how intelligence works. You can give an assessment with a low confidence. You're expected to do that in the intelligence. You can't just say,
you'd better. Well, this is we have run into a ton of problems in the last 20 years where people have said, oh, high confidence. Like, we now have the declassified CIA assessments of Saddam Hussein prior to us going into Iraq, and they said high confidence. And it turns out when you get into the declassified top secret document that guided all this, they're like, we assess that he wants weapons. I'm like, that's like assessing somebody is hungry is different from assessing that they have a ham sandwich. Mm-hmm. He would like weapons. They told us in the newspapers that he had these things. And it turned out the actual assessment was he just wanted these things. And it was assessed high confidence. And now
that goes to source validation.
One guy, codename Screwball.
Yeah.
A disgruntled chemical engineer from Iraq who'd been processed through the BND German intelligence service. And even the Germans were like, no, man, he is Iraqi. We got that part. But I think they told us to take care with him. So yeah, the source, there was a single source and he was of low quality. But then the CIA turned around and said, assess high confidence. That's a
So
scandal. Nobody
yeah.
went to prison over. They should have. Or they at
So,
least
and I
should
think,
have had, sorry,
no,
they should
and
have had
and
their career ripped up for that.
but I think this is kind of what we're talking about intelligence, because you have the confidence level, and then you have source validation, right? And that's your
Yeah.
point to source validation, where you're trying, and this gets very tricky, and it's much more important when you're dealing with human intelligence. I think source validation, but even when you're dealing with SIGINT, even if you're dealing with SIGINT, because I can have a communications between two people talking, but what is their access to the information? Even though I'm intercepting that conversation, what's their access?
This is super important right now because we have the Epstein files out there. And the number of people online, for example, or in the News Corps or anybody, who actually know how to read intelligence is like you and me and a few other people. Mm-hmm. Out of gajillions of people who want to talk about this stuff. And the Epstein files so far are mainly signals intelligence. They are intercepted emails that are dumped, and there's no context. There's virtually no context. And I'm sorry, the idea that this is the total amount of files that we have on Epstein since the 70s. Obviously, what we're not seeing is the reams and reams of counterintelligence stuff from our country, from other countries. Mm-hmm. There's no way we don't have more on this guy, and it's not available to us. So we have a bunch of unverified SIGINT that's been dumped out in the public, and the public does not have the discipline to do this. And so people are like, well, this person's name appeared 30,000 times. It's like, that means nothing. It could mean something, but it doesn't necessarily mean something. But the people that are involved in assessing whether something is likely to be true or repeatable, or other analysts would agree, that is, you have to have lots of different sources, and they should be, sources that you can qualify in some way. And so talking about the methodology for these things is important for people who have never done it in life and death situations, or professionally, or both, which is almost everybody. So talking about, hold on, what are we looking at? And another intelligence issue I want to bring up here, that's less popular, but it's about to be more important, is the assessment that Vladimir Putin threw the 2016 election to get Trump elected. There's grand juries open in Florida right now for at least the former CIA director, John Brennan, a criminal matter where they tried to cook up basically a biased, if not virtually fake, intelligence report saying that Trump was Vladimir Putin's pick and that Putin took action to make him president, which was different than what the entire intelligence community had concluded 8 weeks before in the prior intelligence community assessment. That comes down to tradecraft. I've done videos on this channel about the tradecraft review that was put out by Director John Ratcliffe's office. And when you get into the report that was done about Trump and Russia in December of 2016, they assessed that Putin wanted Trump specifically. And then when you look at what the sources were, it's looking like the Steele dossier, which was a non-professional product from the United Kingdom.
My understanding, though, on that, there were, if you read, so when the ODNI came back under Tulsi Gabbard, what her argument was, because, and by the way, I think it's very important to note, it's very important, during the first Trump administration, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which was GOP held, concurred with the CIA's assessment. Now we're running into an issue.
In part, they definitely said I'm the guy who busted the Russians being involved in this. So this is why this is so incredibly subtle, is that were the Russians involved? Hell yes, they were. They were all over the place. And even more afterwards.
Think how the Senate, if you look at the Senate intelligence report, they concurred in even the assessment. What Tulsi Gabbard's DNI said was, and this is where I think that we have to be. I think the problem, this has been so politicized, it's very hard to get to the bottom of the truth. Yeah. Because what her argument was is they wanted Clinton to win, And the reason why they wanted Clinton to win is because they can use the emails as blackmail. And so that is kind of the fundamental kind of disagreement in a way of this intelligence. And I think the problem is what you're highlighting, though, Eric, is the problem when you put politics into intelligence on both sides.
Sure.
And this goes back to even my original one about this Reuters report, because even I'm seeing it being politicized, because it goes back to this argument of, one, goes back, we don't know the confidence level of this Reuters report. Two, here's another thing, we don't know the intelligence cutoff. So when you build an intelligence report, there's what is called an intelligence cutoff, where you say, I cannot improve any new intelligence because I have to make an intelligence assessment.
You have to hit stop and go, what do we got?
And because there might be a critical intelligence that comes out 24 hours later, but you're like, okay, well, that's okay. Now we got to completely do a different intelligence report, but this stays. Because as of this timeline from the intelligence cutoff, this is the assessment of the U.S. government. But intelligence, and I think people, when they look at intelligence,
and in the fog of war like this, where there's so much going on, I mean, how do you?
But because people think intelligence is trying to predict the future. It's almost like, if I may, and it's a really stupid way. I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, but it's like people who think Polymarket and Kalshi are actual predictive and analytical things. They're not. It's gambling, ladies and gentlemen. It's gambling, and with no morality. But intelligence is not designed to tell you what the future is like. What intelligence is supposed to do is, this is our best understanding based on an incomplete picture. Here's what we think is going to happen. But the reason why it matters is now you can make an informed decision on how to respond to it. Because if I give you an intelligence report, Eric, that says the Russians are going to invade tomorrow, but you can't do anything about it, then what the hell who cares? Okay, cool. I don't give a shit. Let's say, Eric, I have a client who's concerned about medical issues in the Middle East, and I come with them with a report about, but I got this amazing report about supply chain disruptions in South America. I don't care. It's not my problem.
It's not timely, actionable, relevant. Got to be relevant.
That's what intelligence is all about. You try to inform, and then how the intelligence works in the U.S. government. There's intelligence that's given up to the president, to the secretaries, the cabinet members, decision makers within the National Security Council. And then there's intelligence that's designed to go down to the operators, let's say, like the guys on the ground, most of it the military, but you can also have operators from intelligence agencies, law enforcement. And that's how intelligence you have, where intelligence goes to feed up and feed down, and they're framed completely differently. And again, this is where the complexity of intelligence works. And this is where I think in the media and in social media, when people commented, it just glows right. I think the Epstein files is a phenomenal example, because it goes back to even when they declassified the Kennedy files, and you would see all these crazy comments. And what I would tell people is, look at the source description, because you would see these wild statements. Oh my God, this is an FBI report. It has to be true. And then what's the key aspect? Source description. And the source description would read something like this. It's a single source that we have no history of reporting. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? I can't validate it.
So were you mean Kennedy or Epstein or both?
There's both.
All the above.
All the above. You are going to anytime. And I think this is the thing when how many times anybody who served in the military has seen single source human reports that have no historical context or validity, or the source validation or the source scoring is terrible. But because they make a report and it gets because they make a report, they have to distribute it. But that's your job as an intelligence professional, to look at the source description and say, is this a valid intelligence report? And this is, by the way, actually, this opens up a great other conversation, which is the aspect of duty to warn, which is the perfect example that we saw in California right now with the Iranian drone threat in the in California, the West Coast.
Somebody called in a potential threat, right? And said there could be, we assess, now it was unverified, it was my understanding, but somebody could hit California as as recompense for what's going on in Iran.
Right. It literally could have just been that. Somebody calls it in on the phone to, let's say, the embassy or to the FBI office in LA and says, I have a report that indicates that Iran is going to launch Shahed 136 drones against Los Angeles tomorrow. And then they hang up. The government,
It's got to be, you can't not say something.
The government has to report it. Exactly.
9/11, you had a bunch of dudes who were taking flight lessons who weren't interested in landing. And they, after the fact, they're like, well, we had a bunch of Saudis who wanted to fly planes, but they didn't want to land. Well, okay. You know, if it was just one guy, maybe he got cold feet and he doesn't need to worry about landing because he's never going to take a flying lesson again. If it's 6 guys, it's more interesting. But in order to know that it's a pattern of 6 guys, someone's got to call it in.
So but the important aspect exactly when you're doing with the government, how it works, the duty to warn. In other words, when the government, by law, the U.S. government has to inform you. Let's say Eric Garland, your name pops up in an ISIS database for whatever reason. It could have been like they just bought from the black market to steal your credit card information because they wanted to make money. But right. if they find out, hey, Eric Garland, you're in an ISIS database, by law, because of a duty to warn, they have to inform you. But ISIS might have been interested in stealing your credit card information rather than actually you're a target, right? So the duty to warn is a much lower threshold than actionable threat intelligence reporting, where you then actually address it and maybe action upon it based on increased law enforcement, or the embassy does a warning to American citizens. Those are 2 separate things.
Of course.
So that's why you get a lot of threat reporting that gets distributed for Iran. I've seen it extensively about cartels, where it's like, yeah, okay, yes, there's a threat reporting. The media picks it up, reports on it as if it's a fact. It's like, well, wait a minute. It's a single source human report that we don't have a good history of this guy really reporting that much. Sure. Or even if he does, but it's single source. It's one guy who claims it. We have nothing to verify it. And anybody who's done anything legal can understand what witness testimony and relying on just people is the worst form of trying to get to the bottom of the matter and the truth. And I think that's another aspect. And this is what gets lost because there's so much nuance. It's very convoluted. It's very complex. But sometimes it's just easier, Eric, as you said, like, here's the soundbite. Let's make money through social media.
Right. You know, or there are people that want to increase the tension, or they want to get political points against the guys who have sought to confront the Iranian regime. There's a lot of people who want everything that Donald Trump does to be equally bad and unreasonable. Okay, you know, and they're welcome to do so. But, you know, for us as the public, okay, we're going to have news. And, you know, I would say that we have a real trust gap between our institutions and the general public here. Take, for example, going all the way back to 9/11 and the days after that, we got told Iraq's a threat. Well, it wasn't. I mean, theoretically, they were not friendly. Not anymore when we stopped paying them. And, you know, they had, you know, Saddam Hussein was kind of a mob boss who ran this territory. And he didn't like us. But, you know, he was a wily cat. And he hated the Wahhabs. He hated the guys who pulled off 9/11. But then they turned, you know, there was a political move to say that he was friends with them. And maybe his people met with Mohammed Atta in Prague or whatever. And it was all crap. So what are the American people to do when they've been told we need to go to war, we need to invade Baghdad? Okay, so we get done with that, and then you have another 10 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know the threat of Iran's been there the whole time, and then people are trying to assess. Okay, all right, so now this actually looks like war, but none of our kids are going over there. This is not Vietnam right now. Though we were just in Iraq for 10, 15 years. And people are trying to parse through what they're hearing for news when you have such a strong trust gap between the White House and the media. the Pentagon
So
and the media. So it's just a very
yeah,
volatile time
what
for
I
all
would
of this.
say, what I would say to the American people, right? I think 2001 and 2003, in many aspects, were watershed moments in the U.S. intelligence community.
Sure.
One, because of the failure of 9/11 and the intelligence failures of the 9/11 Commission, and one of the things that was created as a response to that was the Department of Homeland Security, right? It's ways, and let's be honest, love it or hate it, we haven't had another 9/11 since then. Right. And unfortunately, that's how the US government, by the way, works. We have to fail to fix it.
Sure.
This is how it is. Every regulation that the US government has designed is on the blood of somebody. That's just how it works. So that's number one.
I had colleagues in DC who had a meeting booked at the Pentagon on the 12th of September 2001 to discuss non-state actor networks as opposed to nation state threats. So rather than focus on the near peer competitor in the Pacific, China, to focus on these these non-state actor networks that had pulled off the USS Cole, the embassy bombings, and of course they never had the meeting because it was overtaken by events.
Mm-hmm.
And we were post Cold War, and we were really looking at the near peer competitor in the Pacific as being our next main antagonist, potentially, which is hypothetically why we were engaging with them and doing so much business with them as a way to diffuse that future tension. We probably overdid it in some people's opinion, but then we found out that we were not staffed up to really understand the non-state actor networks, Al Qaeda and all that, and we learned the hard way.
And then that goes to, though, by the way, because that's the Department of Homeland Security. But then there's another aspect where I think the failures of the invasion of Iraq is what led to the creation of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI. And look, this latest round in Iran, I mean, we obviously we see the administration, the talk. It's not like Iraq where they had these large talking points, right? That's not really. This clearly is because of the protests that killed over 30,000. I think Trump was done, and that's why he said that's when we saw the buildup. That's when and really it was just the military buildup. Sometimes, especially with Trump, I would say, don't look what he says, look what he does, right? That's his key aspect. But let's look at the ODNI, right? Okay, so yes, we had the failure of the Iraq War, but I think that's something that we kind of need to move past because that gets holed up a lot against the U.S. But let's call something that was a huge success for the U.S. They called the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not only did they call it, they had the invasion plan down to a T. We knew everything of how the Russians were going to invade Ukraine, to the point where William Burns, the former CIA director, went to Zelensky. There's a phenomenal New York Times report way back then that covered this. And he went to President Zelensky and said, this is the Russian invasion plan. Good luck. And you can make the argument that the reason why the Ukrainians were able to withstand the initial onslaught from the Russians is because we gave them the plans. And the Russians never adjusted it because they don't know how to. And that's what, so yes, I understand the invasion of Iraq. That was 20 years ago. That's like telling and not taking into account the lessons learned and things. I'm not saying trust the government. I'm never going to be that guy. But the failures of the US, for example, in the 50s or the 60s are and in the 70s with Vietnam are not the same problems that we had in the 2000s that we have now. And this specific war with Iran, it's not necessarily per se an intelligence perspective of an immediate threat in many aspects and ways. I think it's more, I mean, I think President Trump didn't articulate it just like the 2003 war, this huge cause for war. But at the same time, even though there's a lot of American people who are against it by the polls, it's not a motivating factor. And so this is where, the Trump administration says, okay, now I have leeway to operate how I see fit, regardless of Iran, because clearly Iran wants to push that cost onto the Americans, specifically, let's say, with the price of gasoline. But this isn't an intelligence fight. And if anything, I would even make the argument that the intelligence has been successful, because to my earlier comment all the way at the back of this, is that the number of missiles and cruise missiles and drones that the Iranians have launched in response to this type of regime change operation is significantly less than what I would have assessed and believed. And that the only logical explanation is that because in the beginning salvos of strikes that the US and Israel did, they specifically targeted Iran's ability to punch back. I think what is it that they launched? 10 mines in the Straits of Hormuz? Are you kidding me? That's it? With all due respect, from a tactical military perspective, that's a joke. That's not a robust military capability. And again, it goes back to, it shows that the US, from a tactical operational level inside of Iran, has a very clear understanding with the Israelis. We have a very clear understanding of how the Iranians fight, and we know how to disrupt it. And that's what we're doing. Everything else is a political conversation outside of the realm of you and I, where we're having this conversation of intelligence. I
agree. And the success of this mission, I mean, you can see the Israelis' fingerprints all over it in I think good ways, in that they know everything about this regime. They've had decades to warm it up, and now that it's gone hot shooting war, these guys can't fire missiles. They can't keep their senior leadership alive. They can't put mines into the straits the way they thought they could. And that is fed by intelligence. That, intelligence intensifies the lethality of the actual kinetic operation. It's a force multiplier, and somebody's doing it pretty well, it seems.
Intelligence drives operations. That's it. Intel drives operations. That's and again, it goes to that Reuters article. Like, there's a lot of things, and then the question is, obviously the administration is probably going to look in, but that report, I promise you, if there's a conversation within the administration of, okay, well, we want regime change, okay, got it, we're not there now, but we want it, I guarantee you that same intelligence report has their recommendations of how to get there. And maybe that's where, if we're not going to know, because that's super classified, obviously.
Sure.
But that's where you have to look for anybody here. What is U.S. and Israel doing now compared to where they were a week ago? And I think that's where we're seeing the shift in the target packages. Where a week ago was much more in the Iranians' ability to punch back and kind of the symbology and the leadership. Now, even there is a much more intense focus, specifically from the Israelis, on targeting the units responsible on the ground for regime stability. And I think the goal is,
the Basij,
from a kinetic and non-kinetic perspective, is to cause that regime internal security apparatus to crumble. And I think that's the goal. It will be hard to see if it's successful, but that's the things that I'm looking at that's kind of catching my attention.
Well, first you knock out the missiles. You put their navy on the bottom of the Gulf, and then you decapitate as many of the actual leaders as you can, and then you go to the secret police, so that anybody who tries to start a new regime doesn't get killed, tortured, thrown in a hole by the local security forces. Makes sense. And the first, like,
we're only 2 weeks. We haven't even hit week 2.
They have no navy. They no longer have an air force. I don't know what their army's looking like, but I'll bet it's not great. They don't really. I gather that the leadership is in northeastern Iran right now.
That's the rumor that they.
That's the rumor. It's rumored
that they went up to northeast Iran. That they went up there, which I would be very cautious, because that is also when the protests start in Iran, that's a hotbed of where a lot of the protests occur.
So it might not be a place to run for safety.
But it's far away from the U.S. and Israeli reach for now, or not really, because we've seen strikes in that town, in that city specifically as well.
But at the end of the day, I mean, like, we flew planes from Missouri and blew up their nuclear program. From Missouri.
Yeah.
We blew up their nuclear program. Like, we have the reach, we have the capabilities, and we have the leadership that wants to get it done. So they're getting it done. So how long will this regime stick around? I mean, I think some of this is psychology, and you let them go through they've had to go through some necessary evolutions following our initial strikes. They've had to look to Russia and discover that Russia is not going to come to their aid. They're looking to China, their partners, and no one's coming. The Chinese are not coming to their aid. They can't. I mean, China's got to deal with disruptions to its petroleum supply chain first and foremost, and then financial, and then there are a lot of our strategic partners have played footsie with the Iranian regime more than they've talked about. So that's all coming apart. So, couple 2 to 4 weeks for everybody involved in that to realize this is never going back to normal. So you need to make a deal. You need to negotiate on our terms, not yours.
I feel like it's as I said this and I'll say it again. The aspect of regime stability, more importantly, kind of in the broader context of this idea of the will to fight. It's a very hard thing to measure. That's the hardest thing to measure because there's not a single point of intelligence that can dictate to you, is the regime going to collapse? It's in the aggregate. It's the large scale. And generally the problem you run into is that that's not necessarily all the time the focus of intelligence, because the intelligence is trying to focus on specific requirements to try to address it and then enable the operations, right? So it's much more generally pinpointed when you're trying to deal with very broad-based aspects. And it's very hard. Like, what is, and frankly, I'm just going to say it in maybe non-scientific terms. What's the vibe? Very hard to measure when you're talking about tens of thousands and not hundreds of thousands of people. That's what you're looking for. And what are the metrics that you get? It's difficult. You can get indicators like here, we've seen this unit desert, we've seen these guys defect, we've seen these guys have no food, these guys are complaining about pay. But does that necessarily all translate into a complete breakdown in the command and control?
And the only thing you have to compare to is other regimes coming apart, or this regime or this country having gone through a political revolution before. So you can look at the end of the Soviet Union, which was all over the place. You had the Berlin Wall comes down 1989, and then you just have like a lot of people going out in blue jeans and t-shirts singing songs in the Baltics, and then it all collapsed. Mm-hmm. In Iran, you have the 1970s, uprisings against the Shah, and then things got really out of hand, and then they invaded our embassy and all that. But this is totally different. I mean, it's got commonalities, no doubt. These are Iranians, but what happens this time, and what are the weak signals that we look for prior to the thing happening? That is it's a brand new original problem that intelligence analysts tonight are working on.
It's very. That's why we don't know the confidence level of the intelligence report. We don't know the scope. That's another thing. The scope of it. That's something I didn't even talk about, because it could just be the scope. The conversation could be, is the scope the ability of the new supreme leader to just have conversations and be able to have command and control, not necessarily in the aspect of regime desertion or others or internal time. Again, there's so much we don't know about it that it's very easy to say something that is true in the intelligence report, but as you said, it's missing context. And I think that's where it's when you're dealing with this, you have to have that background and understanding to kind of be able to frame it. And I think, Eric, to your point, I think the problem we're running into, this is the government, where the government, I think this is what they do, bread and butter, and they love it. But you and I have had this conversation where corporations, they don't care about this, and they should, but they have completely abandoned all aspects. I think maybe certain corporations, we're seeing it's coming back, but for example, specifically the geopolitical aspects and the geopolitical intelligence for corporations to make decisions, and it's lacking. And you see it now where all these corporations, a lot of them come, oh, we didn't see this coming. Okay, I don't know what else you need.
So I'm doing a lot of work with the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows. I'm doing interviews with some of my colleagues there. I'm one of the fellows. We were just talking not long ago about how the 1990s, the corporate intelligence, which is when I got in, the corporate intelligence was every bit as sophisticated as government, if not more so, in spots, especially in some of the companies that really invested in it. And then that was all stripped out especially in the latter 2000s and the last 10 years or so. You're preaching to the choir, you know. But people, you know, it's time to start. It's time to start paying attention to geopolitics again. And one thing's for certain: if you look at all of what's going on with our relationship to the UK, Russia, Ukraine, this Iran thing, Mexico, globalization is not going the way people dreamed 20 years ago. You know, certainly not 30, where we sort of gently enter this age where corporations, the new national actors, and nations all get along through the WTO and the United Nations, and NATO is by and large obsolete, and we just gently start increasing each other's GDP per capita. That's not what's going on. That was the dream 28 years ago ish, with certain globalist types, but no longer. So it's time for everybody to start paying attention to this geopolitical stuff again, because this is, you look at how nervous everyone gets when we start changing supply chain for petroleum. And people were wondering why Trump was drill baby drill so much as soon as he got back in office. I think he knew he was going to make these heavy changes here in Iran, and he wanted to make sure that our country could ride out, to the degree possible, we could ride out any shocks to the supply chain, because we do have onshore capabilities and some offshore capabilities, or near shore, I should say. This is we're making real changes now, doing real stuff. So
I think the message I would say to anybody who's listening, especially in the industry and all that, you made a mistake in cutting intelligence departments, specifically those that kind of deal with in the geopolitical side. That used to be a cornerstone of every, specifically Fortune 500, Fortune 100, that have international reach. I think I've actually written a paper about this and published it on a security website, and how GSOCs, for example, all they care about is the immediate physical security and cybersecurity. It's like, guys, there's a lot of other problems that you're not looking into. And they're so narrow focused, and like, what's the immediate 50-meter target? And they don't have the ability or the guidance or the power to look at the 300-meter target, the kilometer target, 3 months ahead, 10 months ahead. And I think that has been a significant disservice to a lot of corporations. I'm starting to see slowly that turning around in certain aspects, but it's nowhere near it. And it's crazy how Russia, Ukraine didn't wake people up. And I think people just become complacent. And maybe Iran is the wake-up call, because now this latest iteration of war has hit a major financial center, which is Dubai, which maybe shocked a lot of people. And that's the closest that they're ever going to get hit at home. But this is the future, guys. And you need to reinforce it. You need to focus on it, because the next war could easily be China, Taiwan. So
yeah, speaking of old situations that that suddenly bubble up and they're happening. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, where we were making all the semiconductors, mm-hmm. and we started shifting to over here. Well, there's a lot of people who are going to be happy to hear somebody other than me say that the corporations were wrong to defund all those departments. But
clip that, and blow it up, guys.
That's happening. That's happening. But before we go here, you wanna pump up Sitrep, and I did a video recently that's getting some good audience about Sitrep. We don't have a business deal in place there. I was just reviewing it for my audience, because it's a fun app. It's not expensive. It fits in your phone, and it's like having 200 intelligence analysts. So how's it going?
It's going great. I mean, obviously, I've seen a significant increase in demand recently. But for those who don't know, by all means, check Eric's video. He did a great job explaining it. How it was built. It had to be pretty self-explanatory to use, because if we had to give you a tutorial how to use it, then we failed. And our thought process with Sitrep was, It was to give people the ability to have what used to be corporations and government would pay, to this day, still tens of thousands of dollars to use. And, ours is a subscription base, 1 week for free trial period, $10 a month, to give what others pay tens of thousands of dollars to have access to. And even some of those systems were very subpar and outdated. And, a lot of people now are using it for the Middle East, but almost every country in the world has alerting. So let's say you're going to Curacao, there in the Caribbean, and you don't know anything about it. There's a data feed specific for Curacao, pushing you news from Curacao as if you live there. And so it's a tool that in your phone, not only are you receiving open source intelligence from all the countries around the world, basically, but you're also receiving as if you live in that country. That's how we want to build it. Pretty self-explanatory. So instead of having to pay, dozens of dollars for millions of different subscription all at once for different countries to try to get an idea and a limited understanding, with $10, you have all the news around the world at your fingertip. And as you said, as if you're an intelligence professional, as if you're an ocean analyst, and what a lot of corporations and governments specifically pay a lot of money to get, you get it for $10. So Sitrep available on Google and Apple.
Give it a shot. I mean, like, if you like following the news, you get nothing but high quality news, low, medium, and high importance. High importance, something blew up. Medium, something might blow up. And green can be the tennis team came home and they gave a demonstration in the Capitol here, and it's from all these countries. And I love the mix of the green, yellow, red. That sometimes the green stuff is not what I'm interested in this very second, because Latvia might not be in a state of emergency, but knowing what's going on there, like what is I looking into Canada, and it's like Quebec, they're voting on a new provincial budget. Where did this happen? Quebec City. Yep, it's March, and and there's whatever. It's the business of civilization, and it's high quality stuff, and we could use, and it's all impassioned. It is there's no emotion in it. It's just professional. So I'm a fan. So that's
the
why.
5 W's: who, what, where, when, why. And you get a detailed analysis. And more importantly, you get a historical context, which explains to you why it matters and what's the context of it. Because again, context matters. So you get all of every single alert. I think on average, I don't know, I would have to get the exact number, but thousands of reports are generated on that every day. Thousands and thousands and thousands of reports. So it's constantly updating every second, all the time, and you get it. Whatever country you're interested, you'll get it. But yep, and that's it. Sitrep from Artorias.
That's our boys here. All righty. Well, this was a great opportunity to chat with you, see what you think about the world, and we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely. I had a great time. Thank you so much for Eric. This was a great conversation. And I will say, we were going back and forth what we were talking about, but I think we honed in on the thing that actually we're both passionate about. It's just intelligence in this world. And I think that was a phenomenal, in-depth academic conversation that I truly enjoyed and very much necessity. So I really appreciate the time to join you and talk to you today.
Thanks for being here. And thanks for watching. Take care.